Right, it's my pleasure to introduce Professor Basri. Professor Gibor Basri did his undergraduate work at a university about 60 miles south of us and received his PhD at the University of Colorado, Boulder. He joined the astronomy department in Berkeley in 1982. He is a distinguished astronomer. His research has covered many topics, including brown dwarf stars, and his papers are very widely cited. Gibor is involved in science education and throughout his career has worked on encouraging participation of minorities in science. His efforts in this and on behalf of increasing diversity at the university were recognized by the Chancellor's Award for Advancing Institutional Excellence in 2006. In 2007, he was selected by Chancellor Bourgeois after a national search as founding Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion at Berkeley. He stepped down in 2015 and was awarded the Berkeley Citation, the campus's highest honor. He became professor of the graduate school in 2016, meaning he is an active emeritus professor. Today, Gibor will tell us the history of affirmative action at the University of California and its many twists and turns. Gibor?
Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you all for coming to listen. Obviously, the talk today is about something that is, some of you may already have voted. I have, and some of you may be thinking about it. So this talk is primarily for you. I will not say how to vote on this proposition because I'm not supposed to be advocating. I will present the facts that I think are relevant as I see them personally. So you heard that I was Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion, but I'm now retired, and this is my personal perspective on these issues. The reason I felt that I needed to give this talk was that the original proposition that this proposition repeals, Prop 209, was confusing to many people. And I've also heard from many people that the ballot information for Prop 16 is also very confusing. So I'm hoping to clarify matters and just provide background here. Now I'm going to talk primarily about the black-white dichotomy in higher education, but that's just one particular issue. And there are many other issues that are related that Prop 16 has an effect on. So although I'll often use that example, remember that essentially social injustice is what this is really about. And so Prop 16 actually affects areas beyond higher education, including contracting, business things, and so on. I probably don't need to say this, but I'll say it anyway. The reason for Prop 16 is that our society isn't exactly colorblind yet, or gender blind, or a number of other ways. But as I said, I'll usually talk about the black-white dichotomy. So, what's the evidence that there's systemic racism? Our so-called president recently actually forbid people from talking about this in diversity trainings because he doesn't want folks to think about it. But the data is very broad, deep, and pervasive on the fact that there has been systemic racism in this country for a long time. These are just a few examples here. For example, the wealth of white families is about 10 times that of black families. And that really is a result of a long set of centuries, really, of policies and practices that made that happen. The prison population, as you know, is much stronger percentage people of color than it is in the population, and so on. I'm not going to stick too long on this topic. Another area where it really affects people's lives, like really their life, is health disparities, and all these things are related in the sense that poverty, lack of education, lack of opportunity are the reasons why these things happen. Just for a kind of current example on the right here, can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Yes. So this chart, for example, right now shows the age-adjusted COVID hospitalization rates. And you can see that the two populations, you'll notice this sometimes in some of these charts, the two populations that were treated most poorly at the founding of America, Native Americans and Blacks, are often in the worst positions now. And so it's a very long-standing issue, but here the hospitalization rates are much higher than for whites or Asians. Fine. I think we're probably willing to accept this. Let's look in more detail now, though, at the University of California. Here are a couple of charts which sort of show, and the reason I show them is these are the effects that affirmative action is intended to do something about. So, for example, 12th graders in California now. Here's the racial makeup of 12th graders, that is high school graduates. Well, here's high school graduates, in fact. First of all, it's maybe surprising to a few of you. The white student population of high school graduates now is a distinct minority here. And the pink is the Asian. The high school graduates now are already dominated by Latino students. And African Americans are actually in California a pretty small percentage of the population. But then you notice that the bars shift as we move over towards, this is UC freshmen, basically, successful UC freshmen on this side of things. Here is the high school graduates, and here's the UC admits. So you can see there's a change that takes place here. In particular, Asian students are more successful as UC admits than they are in the high school graduate population. And Latinos, on the other hand, are less successful. Whites are also less successful than Asians here. And a lot of these charts are a little misleading because you can't really see what's going on with African Americans because there's such small bars at the bottom. So this isn't really the right way to show this, but there's also a significant drop from here to here for African Americans. So this is the current situation and this is the whole UC system, not just Berkeley. Here is the situation with respect to people who move along in their professional lives. So this is the undergraduate population in the whole UC system. Interestingly, the Latino fraction is growing steadily here. That's basically mostly because the Latino population here, this isn't shown for the same way, but that's been growing steadily. So you can see it's a large chunk now. It's not as large a chunk of the undergraduate population as it is in the population, but it is growing. So the Latino population is growing. When people cite the effects of Prop 209, the opponents of Prop 16 argue that, well, the Latino population of undergraduates has recovered since Prop 209. And they simply neglect to mention that the Latino population of high school graduates has tripled since then. So the fact that it's recovered really doesn't tell you that things are fine. At the graduate student level, you can see while whites are not a majority here, they become a majority here. And also, though, in the University of California and sort of in the professional realm, especially in STEM fields, the international contribution starts being significant. So this is graduate students in academic fields and in professional fields. The international contribution is significant. The Latino population and the African American population drop quite a bit after you get out of the undergraduate situation. And then coming over to the last piece, this is what our faculty looks like in the University of California. So that is the effect of decades of discrimination against other groups. Basically, the faculty is largely white or international, and that's because up until sort of 50 years ago or so, the university really wasn't accepting anyone from these other populations. You just weren't able to become a faculty member. The same story I could show for women as well. Women are a little bit like Latinos in the sense that they're 50% of the population, and their numbers, even in the faculty ranks, have been growing so that it's over a third now. So we still need to get from a third to a half for women. But it's largely white women who are benefiting from the growth in gender participation. All right, so let's get now to the specifics of affirmative action and the issue of fairness. The opponents of Prop 16 basically argue that it's not fair if you use affirmative action. So fairness is going to be a topic that I keep returning to. Prop 209 was passed in 1996 by less than around a third of registered voters. And I'll come back to that. But, you know, the lack of voter participation really does have a major effect on policy, as we all know. And it's very important that people vote. At any rate, 1996 was, you know, 2 or 3 decades after the civil rights movement. So here's a guy who was important in the civil rights movement, Martin Luther King Jr. Here's a guy who tried to pretend that he was like that, but was very much the opposite. So this is Ward Connerly. He was actually a regent of the University of California at this time in 1996. Actually, before Prop 209 even, he got the University of California to pass a regental law that would forbid affirmative action in the university, and then took it statewide and successfully passed Prop 209, which was entitled the California Civil Rights Initiative, trying to tie himself directly to this guy. And, you know, it sounded like it too. Said the state shall not discriminate against or grant preferential treatment to any individuals or group on the basis of race, sex, color, ethnicity, or national origin in the operation of public employment, public education, or public contracting. So these are the arenas in which Prop 209 and Prop 16 operate. You might notice that it's public. And so Prop 209 does not apply to that other place 60 miles down the peninsula, for example. That place is still allowed to use affirmative action if it wishes, and it does to a certain extent. So really these propositions affect primarily the public arena, and of course we're all UC retirees, so it affects our institutions. But this does sound kind of like a civil rights act, right? It's or grant preferential treatment to, that is the part that's intended to kill affirmative action here. Yeah, but it'd be great if the state doesn't discriminate against. That's good. And it was this title and this language that I think, even given that some people knew what this was really about and didn't vote for it, but a majority of the 1/3 of registered voters did vote for it. Just to be clear on what the intent of this was, the next year or two, Connerly led another initiative campaign to pass Prop 57, and that would have simply forbidden the collection of any data on race or ethnicity. So the idea there was just, you can't complain about racism if you have no data that says there is any. So just that made it pretty clear what these folks were really about. So they were not on the same side of racial justice. Now, though, what's the deal here? Why isn't this the California Civil Rights Initiative? We'll get to that in a moment. Let me talk a little bit more about the effects then once that passed. So this is the kind of thing that it was intended to, that affirmative action was intended to correct. This is the participation in quality colleges, and I think the University of California definitely qualifies as a quality college, by different racial groups. And you can see that the dark bars here are the bottom 50% colleges, and the light bars are the top colleges, like the University of California. And you can see the participation in the bottom colleges versus the top colleges is very, very much, again, correlated with race. When Prop 209 went into effect at the University of California, here's what happened with the populations of students there. So you can actually see very clearly when it went into effect. Here's the whole UC system, and this is UC Berkeley. There was a precipitous drop in the number of African-American students at UC Berkeley, absolutely due directly to the passage of Prop 209. So in case you were wondering what the intent behind it was, this makes it pretty clear what the intent behind it was. Same with Native Americans. As I said, these two groups usually fare worse in these systemic issues. And the Latino population also dropped. Whereas the white and Asian, I guess Asian isn't, yeah, here it is. They were flat through that. So that's what actually happened. So what is why isn't the Prop 209 a racial justice act? The basic reason, and this is the main point of my talk really, is to let folks know that the American legal system allows particular interpretations of words and practices to make what looks like a fair set of rules operate in a very unfair manner. And so, for example, when the proposition said the state will not allow discrimination or preferences, what did they actually mean by that? How does one determine whether one is looking at discrimination or preferences? This is where the unfairness is built into the system. So for example, if a white student with a higher SAT score is not admitted, while a black student with a lower SAT score is, that is taken as discrimination, evidence anyway, of discrimination based on race against whites. Now, those of you who understand the UC admission system will immediately see what's wrong with that. And yet we constantly have to defend ourselves in court against accusations exactly like this. And in fact, it's this kind of basis that all the Supreme Court affirmative action cases also deals with. So, what's wrong with that? Well, first of all, one isn't supposed to be taking account of the fact that admission isn't actually based solely, and not even mainly, in the University of California on SAT scores. So there are many other factors involved as to whether somebody gets in or not. And in any case, it's never the white student who has the absolutely lowest SAT score that brings these suits. And so other white students with lower SAT scores were admitted too, but somehow they're not relevant to this issue. There's discrimination because a black student was admitted under those conditions. And let's just forget about the fact that there were also a bunch of white students admitted under that same condition. And in fact, this whole idea of, we're going to admit the best students is a similarly skewed argument. That the really question is, what does best mean exactly? What are all your criteria for picking the best person? As Vice Chancellor, I had a lot of discussions about this on the faculty side. So we want to pick the best faculty members. Is that entirely determined by their number of publications and citation rates? Do we care about what kind of teacher they are? Do we care about what kind of students they'll bring along? Do we care about how they will serve the state and so on? What is in fact the figure of merit? So that is a place where that completely valid discussions, long ones, can be and are had. But usually what happens in case law against affirmative action is they get super oversimplified and in the wrong way. And the legal system seems to be happy with that. But it's the public universities in California that have to defend against these kinds of cases. As I said, private universities are not covered by this law. And it was in this context that those student populations that you saw plummet, did plummet after Prop 209. On the other hand, you can look at other things which you might think were evidence of discrimination, and they are not taken as evidence of discrimination. For example, the fact that severely underfunded public schools are filled with students of color is no legal indication or evidence that discrimination is going on. Or the percentage of Black students in universities is much lower than in their population over decades. Or even that Black families have 1/10 the wealth of white families. From the legal system's point of view, that's not evidence of discrimination. Not sure what it is evidence of, but not that, especially in the context of these affirmative action suits. If you want to find something like this is discriminatory, the legal system demands that you prove that that there was discriminatory intent behind the policy that's causing this. You have to find, a taped conversation or a set of emails or something, and it doesn't matter whether it's obvious what the policy was about and that it actually accomplished its purpose. That doesn't mean it's discriminatory. And I could apply that to Prop 209 itself. I would say actually that was a discriminatory policy, but I would never be able to prove that in the legal system. Let's take the other side of things, which is preferences. Remember, the 209 says you cannot discriminate or provide preferences. And of course, we get a skew in the other direction with preferences. Okay, so for example, the previous example that I used, the same thing. If a white student with a higher SAT score isn't admitted and a Black student with a lower SAT score is, that could just as easily be tagged as a preference for the Black student. Could be either discrimination against the white student or a preference for the Black student. Both have been argued. And then even worse, if the percentage of Black students chosen out of a pool of applicants that has already been pre-selected so that anyone in that pool meets all the qualifications for admission, then if the percentage of Black students changes positively, we're immediately charged with some kind of preference. It's a hidden preference, or the admissions committees are, using preferences that they're not willing to admit, and so on. And again, the university spends a bunch of money defending itself against this kind of argument. Okay. On the other hand, it is not evidence of preferences if, for example, extra admission points are given to children of alumni. Now, I have to immediately note that the University of California doesn't do this. We don't have legacy admissions. But in other states where they do, this is not charged as a preference. This is not illegal, obviously. The Harvard admissions case that's going on now in Massachusetts, is looking at this, but basically it's fine. And it's not a preference that's been in place for a long time. It's especially not affirmative action for children of alumni. Okay, but you give them a preference very, very straightforwardly. But that, from a legal point of view, that doesn't really count. Or, and children of large donors, I would have said the University of California also doesn't do that. But, recently we've heard stories to the contrary in the paper. But, it's certainly not the policy of University of California to do this. But it certainly is the policy of many universities to do this, and that is not seen as a preference. Or, for example, if you give weight in the admissions process to activities that only the affluent can afford much more easily. Okay, you can say, okay, that's not a racial preference, except we saw the data on wealth of white families versus Black families. So if you actually intended to be fair, you might want to rethink that a bit. Another issue is the fact that many of the deciding committees, especially in faculty hires and appointments to positions of power, they're largely composed of white men, and that's just because, again, we saw that in the faculty composition. It's just a historical fact. There were so many the institution was so white before, and people stick around for a long time. We're all retired, but many aren't. That's just how it is. But that's not considered in any way an evidence that a preference might be occurring based on race or gender. Just because I think that's the way it's always been. Those deciding committees have always looked like that. They're starting to change now. Now, I'm not claiming that that those committees are deliberately executing preferences based on race or gender. The truth is, all of us prefer the familiar. If we have a set of applicants, and some of them are very familiar to you, they talk the same way, they have the same background, the same thinking, you will prefer those applicants, and that's natural. But that is still a preference when the composition of the committees is skewed on race or gender. However, the legal system does not acknowledge this at all. So, under Prop 209, if you did care about social justice, you might say, all right, well, California passed Prop 209. That's the story. I mean, we did say that because that is the story. And so folks have looked to compensate for that by using proxies of systemic racism, like lower socioeconomic status. Or, this method was actually developed in Texas first, but you could say, we're going to admit, in principle anyway, the top X% of each high school class. And then that way, all these underserved public schools filled with students of color, some of their students will be admitted in principle under this practice. As a matter of actual fact, they were eligible for admission to the University of California. It didn't mean that they could get into Berkeley, though. There were other criteria after that. And a long period of time went by where we tried to make these proxies work to undo the systemic racism that 209 was supporting. And the fact is, it didn't really quite work. And the University of California regents, actually, who changed their mind, by the way, after Ward Connerly, less than a decade later, the regents passed a different set of policies which acknowledged specifically the academic benefits of diversity and said it is a priority to remedy historic discrimination in the University of California. So the regents did file an amicus brief in favor of affirmative action in the last Supreme Court case from Texas, the Fisher case. But it explained that none of these proxies have been able to work properly. And the basic reason is they're not focused on the problem. So it's fine, it's good. It's a good idea to take account of people's socioeconomic status. But there are a lot of non-Black people with low socioeconomic status too. And so if you were trying to fix the effects of anti-Black racism, this is not going to really get you there. Okay, and then just as another matter within California, because the Prop 209 only applies to public universities, it ties the hands of the University of California. It does not tie the hands of private universities in California or the hands of universities in any other state that doesn't have such a law. And only 8 states in the union have such a law. And so it puts us at a real disadvantage because other folks can target the best Black students, for example, and we can't. So that has also been an issue for the University of California. And then I really, really want to make this point strongly. The entire idea behind these suits, and you're probably going to see another one at the Supreme Court, and I wouldn't be surprised given the about to be composition of the court that they agree that affirmative action is not needed anymore. The argument is that some student claims that they lost their spot. They were not admitted because of affirmative action. And I just wanted to spend a little time on what a fallacious argument that is. First of all, as I pointed out earlier, they always think they lost their spot to a person of color because of a program that addresses systemic racism, rather than for some other reason. Like, for example, another white student got in. You know, that person took a spot. How do you know that wasn't your spot? Or, you know, maybe the university wanted students who were interested in humanities or social science, and you were interested in science. And they gave all these spots to these students who were interested in humanities that could have been yours. Or, you know, or the opposite. Maybe they wanted students who do STEM and you don't do STEM. You can kind of see where I'm going with this. You know, there's no such thing as your spot. Or, you know, universities allow athletes to be admitted who aren't the highest academic performers, because the university supports a variety of sports programs and they want people who can participate in those sports programs. There went your spot, right? I mean, a spot is a spot. Or musicians for the orchestra, or rural students. We want a certain number of rural students as well as urban students. We do that. All of these things actually come into the composition of each freshman class. Or maybe it's just because the university already feels like it has enough students who look a lot like you, and it wants some students who look some other way in all kinds of dimensions. That's essentially the diversity issue. And I should say that the word university really means it's kind of a universal set of activities and of folks. And so you don't get a university if, for example, we could just take the top 4,000 students who have the highest GPAs times their SAT score. Could do that. We probably would get mostly engineers if we did that. Turns out they really are super academic performers. Would we have a university at that point? No, we would not. And so this sort of the whole underpinnings of the argument against affirmative action don't make any sense. And I don't understand why this hasn't been argued more effectively. All right, so let's look at actually what's sort of happening today. First of all, the number of students, period, who apply to the UC has gone up and up and up. We get 100,000 applicants now. We didn't used to get that. And so one argument that the Prop 209 opponents are trying to use is that the admission rate for Asian students has gone down. Well, there's some lying with statistics. Yeah, it went down. That's true enough. It went down for every group because the total number of applicants went up by quite a bit. So yes, everybody's admission rate went down. So don't listen to that one. After the black student percentage, the student population percentage went down for black students, it stayed down. And it's still down now. The last 2 or 3 years, extra efforts have started to move it up a little bit, but this has been an ongoing problem. As Vice Chancellor, I worked on this really hard, couldn't get it to move. And as I said, the Latino student percentage of students has been rising, but actually not as fast as the percentage of high school graduates have been rising. So actually the population percentage has gotten worse for Latino students. And here's white and Asian students. So here, by the way, is the application rate. And notice the application among Latinos has been rising much more rapidly than for other groups. And that's just because of the population in the UC, in California. Okay. Let me now come directly to the fairness question. So I want to tell a little story here, sort of like a Dickens story, and see what you think. So in a village long ago and far away, children in Group A are fed gruel and forced to work in sweatshops for long hours in addition to cleaning and cooking for everyone. Group B goes to school in preparation for taking over jobs and power and gets full meals. This goes on for years, and Group A remains uneducated and undernourished. Now, eventually the sweatshops are closed and Group A begins to get tutoring once a week. But then some of them start to complain about the fact they're still only fed gruel and they're punished by being locked in tiny rooms. However, one day those in charge decide that maybe they've been unfair in feeding Group A only gruel, and they begin to serve them somewhat better meals. All right, without dessert, but better. But unfortunately, this means that Group B gets half as much meat as they used to get because meat is in limited supply. They're asked to show some generosity, and many agree to do so. After a month, though, a lot of Group B begin to object that they're tired of getting less meat than they used to get. They point out that they already gave up half of their meat for a month. And anyway, it wasn't their idea to feed Group A poorly. So why should they suffer for Group A's problems? I won't explain all the components of this story and how they might be analogies to American reality, but you can figure it out. So I ask you, on which side does fairness lie? Should Group B get their meat back at the renewed expense of Group A? Or should Group B continue to be generous until Group A is a little bit better nourished? And then, more pointedly, if Group B refuses to be generous, do they become complicit in inequity? Just food for thought, with or without meat. Okay, now here's a cartoon that's been going around a lot recently that sort of illustrates the difference between equality and equity. So let's look at it for a moment. This says, first thing says reality. So apparently there's this baseball game that everybody wants to watch. And there's a fence in the way. And this person has more boxes than they need to see over the fence. This person has a box and they can see over the fence. And this person is not only short, but they're in a hole. The authors of this cartoon say this is reality. I don't know if that's reality or not. So let's move on here. This is equality. That is to say, everybody gets a box to stand on to see over the fence. This guy could probably see over the fence anyway. Yeah, he can. But he gets a box. And this guy gets a box too, and that helps him see over the fence. And this guy also gets a box, but still looking at the fence. So that's equality. If you give equal benefit to these folks, and yet they're not the same folks, this is the result. Equity would be everybody gets to see over the fence, and that might mean that you give more boxes to the shorty here, and this guy doesn't need any boxes at all. This is, I'd call this affirmative action, basically. Now he can argue that, how come he didn't get a box? And how come he got 2 boxes and he only got 1? But I think the fairness issue kind of explains that all by itself. And then in the last slide, you can kind of wonder why is there a fence there at all? Why don't and that's another good question. Okay. And I just want to add a little bit to this. Suppose that how tall each of these folks were had to do with their level of nutrition from the last story. How would that make you feel about these situations? All right. Well, that's enough of the context that I think lies behind your decision on Prop 16. Let me say more explicitly what Prop 16 does. The main thing it does is it removes Prop 209 from the state constitution. Okay, but the way it does it is it allows, but does not mandate, the use of affirmative action to redress effects of historical discrimination related to those categories from Prop 209. So it's not as though everything that's being done now has to include an affirmative action component. It's just that it could, because right now it cannot, no matter how inequitable the situation, you cannot give the guy a box. Okay, and here are some other things to think about, and this is like the end of my talk. First of all, Prop 209 wasn't passed by a majority of Californians, and that was 1996 when Prop 187 also passed, a very anti-immigrant proposition. Well, that one was killed by the courts too. So things have shifted, hopefully. Secondly, a fair society doesn't waste talent because of bigotry or unequal privilege. There are a lot of talented people who are not able to show their talent because of the systemic issues in our society. And really, in the world, we need everybody on board now. Another point, and this has more to do with the mission of the University of California, diverse professionals better serve diverse communities. And so both the US but particularly California are becoming very diverse. And it'd be nice if all those populations were participating in becoming professionals. In general, it's been shown that a diverse group tends to be better at innovating and has broader perspectives than a non-diverse group. And finally, we probably would all be living in a nicer society if things were more equal. There probably would be less poverty, crime, and resentment, and more productivity and satisfaction. So those are other reasons to vote for Prop 16, because it will push us in that direction. And finally, I debated Representative Ward Connerly while I was Vice Chancellor. And at the end, someone in the audience asked a very good question. Said, well, okay, maybe we need affirmative action now, but how would you decide when it was enough? You may remember that Justice O'Connor said we need affirmative action. This was 30 years ago, but we won't need it in 25 years, probably. So how would you know when you don't need it anymore? Well, that's very easy. We can't make a set of plots like this. In other words, when the disparities caused by historical discrimination become hard to detect in various important measures of well-being, then you don't need affirmative action. And until that's the case, until you can correlate these measures of well-being with race or gender, then you kind of do need it. Okay, well, thanks for listening.
Thanks, Gibor. I think if people have questions, they can type them into the chat. This is a webinar, and I think the way that works is that not everybody can just turn on the mic and speak. But if you put something in the chat, I'll be happy to read it. And while we're waiting to see what questions people come up with, I'll ask Gibor some questions. So,
and I mean, and Bob, so, you know, we have gotten some questions through the Q&A, and
yeah,
Ben,
I can actually see them.
And
okay.
So if you want me to, I can just start. I have to read them out. Should I read them out?
Yeah, why don't you deal with the Q&A questions, Gibor? That's good.
Okay. So the first one is from someone anonymous. It says, I'd like to support Prop 16, but can't shake off the scenario where two students in low-income, low-performing high schools, one Black, one Southeast Asian, and the Asian performed better academically than the Black student, but only the Black student got admitted under affirmative action. How can we justify that we didn't discriminate against the Asian student and gave preference to the Black student? Well, as I tried to argue, there's no such thing as someone's taking someone else's spot. What happened was all of the considerations that go into play in admitting the whole student body ended up meaning that the Asian student, this particular Asian student didn't happen to get in, that particular Black student did. I probably could find another low-income Southeast Asian student who did get in. It might be that this student didn't write quite as compelling an essay as the other one, or whatever. I mean, I think the answer is always that you can't play off one student against another and say one of them got in and one didn't because of affirmative action. It's because of the whole constellation of things that went into composing the admitted class. I mean, I have to tell you, I did find many instances where a student who looked very similar to another student, one of them got in and one didn't. Why did that happen? Well, there were different reviewers looking at them. They liked their essays differently. They had, their own weightings that they went through. The University of California spends a lot of effort trying to norm everybody, but you have committees of people and, they have slightly different points of view. It's all part of the whole process. To then claim that, oh, this happened because of affirmative action, is where the fallacy lied. It didn't happen because of that. It happened because of the whole set of constraints and the way things fell out that way. I mean, I have the same issue with proposals that I write to NASA. You know, sometimes they get accepted and sometimes they don't. And it really has to do with who's on the committee that year and what they kind of like about, you know, what kind of science they'd like to see this year. So this is the way any sort of, let me make one more point. You could take the whole admitted freshman class, throw it out, and fill with the next set of folks who are ranked a little bit lower and be just as happy in a university like Berkeley or Harvard or Princeton. Basically, the pressure on slots is so much larger than the number of slots that, yeah, I mean, you could argue, well, how come this guy got in and this guy didn't? That's just how it came out this year. It would have been okay if the other guy got in. That would have been fine too. It just worked out that way. To then go and say, oh, this is all the fault of affirmative action is pretty suspicious to do. All right, what's the, well, maybe the next question was sort of answered. So the next question is, what would an ideal rubric for student admission look like? Probably looks something like the rubric that they're using, I would say. I did look at those in great detail. You know, you have a million things to balance. You know, I named a bunch of them when I was talking about the fallacy of your spot, but there are many more as well. And so the ideal rubric, in essence, is let's admit a class who we think has high potential to make society better after they get their education. That's the rubric. And, you know, make society better in what way? Well, in lots of ways, you know. Yeah, we want some pre-meds. We want some engineers. We want some poets. We want some musicians. We want some athletes. We want this, we want that. Let's sit down with everything we want and this huge bounty of students who fit that bill and try to figure out, you know, who we'll have here this year. That's how it works. Okay, let's see. To me, the preference given to all who are socioeconomic disadvantaged should work better. I wonder why it didn't work well. Well, I did try to say that a little bit. The effects of anti-Black racism are laser focused on Black people. Low socioeconomic status is an affliction that affects a lot of people. In fact, there are more poor white families in the US than there are poor Black families in the US. The percentage of poor families among the Black population is much bigger than the percentage among white, but the absolute number is actually larger in the white population. And so that's one reason it doesn't work very well. I mean, and I can bring in other groups as well. The main reason it doesn't work is it's really not focused on the problem it's trying to fix. That's basically the answer. Okay, let's see. Someone wants me to just mention again that the actual system for UC is what's called holistic admissions. That is to say, you don't look at the test score for the student only. In fact, they may stop looking at it altogether because test scores have been shown to be highly biased against low socioeconomic status. You don't only look at their GPA, although that's an important metric. And I can tell you with regards to GPA that the University of California spends a lot of time evaluating every school. How many AP courses do they offer? Where do their students go to college? How many of them go to college? There's a ton of metrics around every school. So they understand, you know, when a student's GPA is coming from school X, they know about school X pretty well, actually. But then there are other considerations like leadership. How much leadership has this student exercised? You know, did they join a club or did they start a club? Did the club they started last for 1 year or 3 years? It's really at that level of detail. You know, how culturally broad are they? You know, do they only exist in a tiny little universe, or have they done a bunch of things that make them a broader person? How much do they seem to care about making society better? Because that's the mission of the University of California, and so on and so on. So holistic admissions tries to use a very broad rubric like that and gather as much evidence as it can and make decisions on that basis. And that's why you get very perplexing, admissions decisions where student A with, a 4.5 GPA and a super high SAT score didn't get in. It's because they're holistically, they weren't quite as attractive as somebody else. Let's see. Thought pre-election polls say Prop 16 was behind. Why? That's correct. The last poll I saw essentially predicts that Prop 16 will be defeated again. Why? Because most people don't understand this fairness issue. They don't understand why the language of Prop 209 isn't fair. They don't know what goes on, really. And a lot of them don't appreciate systemic racism. And then there's a bunch of people who think that their kid is not going to get in if they vote for this. They still fall for this fallacy of your spot. Your spot will be taken by someone who is benefiting from this program. So for all those reasons, it is behind. And that's why I'm so sort of passionate about it, although I'm not telling you you should vote for it. But those are the issues. Let's see, did Prop 209 reduce the number of women admitted to UC in STEM fields? I don't think so. I don't think so. And actually, I should say that at the faculty level, Prop 209 had almost no effect, although committees absolutely did say, oh, we can't think about race anymore. But in particular with Black professors, the number of Black professors had gone up, after the civil rights movement, and it leveled off sort of at the beginning of the 90s. And then it stayed level up until 2005, through thick and thin, through recession, through Prop 209, through this. It was just the same number all the time. And I used to argue in these committees, I said, this is, I'm a physicist. When I see, a quantity that is in strong equilibrium against forces, both positive and negative, I have to ask myself, what's creating that equilibrium? Just food for thought. Okay, let's see. The final question is, maybe applicants should get a pink slip as those do in the science professions when their excellent grant is not, approved for funding. Yeah, maybe.
And Gibor, we're getting some questions in the chat box too.
Okay,
I can out when I'm ready. Are there any metrics such as graduation rate, admissions to grad school rate, etc., changed while affirmative action was in effect that would help us to evaluate its effectiveness?
Yes, we do keep track of those metrics like graduation rates and so on. And in fact, that was one of my main tasks as Vice Chancellor, because I wasn't, Vice Chancellor for Equity and Inclusion is actually not in charge of admissions. That's done in student affairs. So I was more concerned with this retention question. Are we admitting students who graduate? And the graduation rates in general for students of color are lower than for white and Asian students. In sort of the general college population in the US, the graduation rates are down around 40 or 50% for those populations. At Berkeley, they are about 85% going up. So in that sense, we're doing a good job. But what I learned was, the graduation rates are probably never going to be equal until society is more equal. So the things that caused people to not graduate typically had to do with their family situation. Their parents lost income. They had a lot of siblings that the parents were hoping they would take care of even while they were a student. They would send their financial aid back home. Someone would get sick in the family and they would need to go home and take care of the sibling. Issues like that, issues that were related to low socioeconomic status did impact students of color more than they impacted white and Asian students. And as far as I can tell, that was the main reason for our not being completely equal in graduation rates. But I will say that the University of California provides enough support that our disparity is not that big even now.
Hi, Gibor, this is Ben Feinberg. I've got another question from Alan Gould. How does the Bakke Supreme Court decision bear on this?
Okay, the Bakke decision, which was essentially the first time the Supreme Court weighed in on affirmative action, was actually favorable to affirmative action. It acknowledged that that's a reasonable thing to do. What the Bakke decision did say, and I would agree with it, frankly, is you shouldn't have quotas. That is to say, you shouldn't and don't, and we don't, say we should have you know, X number of students that are Black, or X number of students that are Latino or Asian or anything. Don't have quotas, have the holistic rubric, but include the fact that you want to make society better, and that the society has this major issue around folks of color. And so it's perfectly okay to do something about that. Plus, it's beneficial for all the other students to have a broad spectrum of perspectives contained in the student body. That will make everybody get a better education. So the Bakke decision was actually supportive of affirmative action and forbid quotas, and that's still the case in the U.S. that we don't have quotas. And of course, Prop 16 certainly wouldn't bring quotas in at all.
Another question from Amelia Marshall. The Nobel Prize in Economics just went to two guys who optimize auction theory. Should their algorithms be applied to UC admission?
I'm afraid I'm not familiar with their auction theory or that Nobel Prize. If you want to talk about the Nobel Prize about the black hole at the center of our galaxy, that I can talk about.
Okay, we have another question here, quoting Malcolm Gladwell, saying that letting a student into a competitive university with lower scores is actually a formula for failure, because having so many of their classmates achieving above their level gives them a lower opinion of themselves, and they have a much reduced chance of graduating.
Yeah, and that argument has been supported by a statistician at UCLA, whose papers have been torn apart by other statisticians, but you know, I hear that one periodically. So first of all, we don't admit anyone who we don't think can succeed. So the issue is that you need to set you should have a minimum level of academic performance below which you don't admit people because they won't be able to make it. Above that level, you expect that everyone who achieves that level of academic performance can succeed at your university. And so then the question of, you know, oh, I shouldn't admit people who might get a C because there's, you know, people who might get an A that will make them feel bad. You know, that's not how it works. Furthermore, of course, you know, we are recognizing that there will be students coming from poorly resourced schools who may have not quite the level of preparation that students from extremely well-resourced schools have. They might have more potential, actually, to help society in the long run. And, you know, maybe it's worth the effort to make sure they succeed because they have the capability. They may not have all the AP courses, for example, because their school simply didn't offer them. So we will take other steps to make sure that they're able to realize their potential. And we think that's, you know, part of our mission as the University of California, to serve the state, to make the best use of its resources. And, you know, one of its main resources these days is people. So yeah, no, I don't buy that argument. You know, I wasn't, I mean, almost nobody is the valedictorian, right? So like, should they be there if somebody else is doing better? I mean, it's a relatively bogus argument, as long as they're qualified to be there.
Let me ask Ross Fisher has, I think, a very good question here. How can your message here be better distributed to the population?
Yeah, right.
Voting population.
Well, you know, I am in touch with the folks who are running the Prop 16 campaign and so on. And the truth of the matter is that the message I'm giving you is really only suitable for a university educated population. I wouldn't make these arguments to the general public. They're too university oriented and maybe too, I mean, they're definitely too long. They take too long to explain. So there is a campaign for Prop 16 The usual, political consultants are driving that. The messages are way less convincing to me, but then I'm not the general public. So I've given them my materials and so on and said, here's how I think you should argue it. But you guys are the experts. And so they're doing what they're doing. And I'm okay with that. I'm just pleased to be able to talk to you folks.
So we have another attendee who said, in principle, could UC replace its current admission system by a fully blind and utterly random lottery for those students who are California residents and adjusted by pruning out the lowest percent who wouldn't be believed to be academically qualified? This might be a nuclear option, but it would certainly shake things up if Proposition 16 fails, including reducing the effective power of the upper 1% in wealth.
I don't think so. I mean, I wouldn't be in favor of that plan. I think that with our holistic admissions policies, we are doing our best to try to, get a good set of folks. We aren't able to, focus on systemic racism with that, but the idea that you can judge who will be best, make the best class at UC Berkeley just through test scores and grades, I think is fundamentally flawed. That's why we have holistic admissions. We want to know more about these students, and it would be very, I mean, we're already, we're already flooded. We have 100,000 applications for 4,000 spots. We don't need more students in the pool. We've got plenty of great ones. The issue around affirmative action is, can we spend some of those slots with this part of the rubric weighted a little higher? That's all. That's really all there is to it. To deal with a particular issue where we think that, the benefit of that down the line is going to benefit society as a whole. So that's what it's about. If Prop 16 doesn't pass, which there's a reasonably good chance that will happen, we'll just keep slogging away trying to get this, to work. I'll be extremely disappointed. California has been, so strong on Black Lives Matter and so on. If you thought any of that made any difference, you'd have to vote for Prop 16. It's, a really easy thing for a person to do that would actually make a big difference to these issues. So, but, don't vote for it if you don't want to.
Gabor, this is Bob Kahn. I wonder if I could ask a question. It sounds to me like the policy that you would prefer actually isn't so different from what I expect is what Harvard does for its admissions. They're trying to create a class that's balanced and so on. But as you know, they've gotten into trouble because they're being sued. And part of the suit, as I understand it, is a comparison being made with Berkeley. Namely, people say, oh, we look at Berkeley, where 50% of the students who are accepted are Asian, and at Harvard, it's 20%. That shows that Harvard is clearly discriminating against Asian students.
Yeah.
So that's the other side of this problem.
Well, I don't know. Can you see my slide again now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can see them.
So here, this pink bar is the Asian students at UC. And this is them in the high school graduate population. I have a lot of trouble believing they're being discriminated against.
No, but they are at Harvard. No, the point is,
their argument is that this would be even bigger. This pink bar would be even bigger if you just use test scores.
Well, but no,
and the answer is yeah, it would be, but that's not how we do it.
but the people at Harvard who are suing the university there are saying, if there are only 20% Asians in the entering class at Harvard, how doesn't that show that there's discrimination? Because at Berkeley, where we know they don't discriminate against Asians, let's suppose that's true, it's much bigger than 20%. You can see whatever it is here, 40% or something.
Right, 40%.
No. So I mean, I guess what I'm saying is, how do we deal with that if we said, oh well, really, the Hispanics should have a bigger fraction than they have, because they're a much bigger fraction of the population, Blacks should have a bigger percentage because they're a bigger percentage of the population. You can't make everything bigger, and somebody's going to lose.
Right.
If we readjust, the guess is the group that's most likely to lose in a readjustment is the Asians. And then they're going to be
That's true.
feeling some discrimination.
Well, you know, I could argue that, you know, it's not fair to whites. They used to be almost the entire population here. And, you know, people did stuff and now they aren't. And so they're being discriminated against. If universities were being filled purely on racial grounds, then the Asians are overfilled already and should be reduced. But the universities are not filled on purely racial grounds. And Harvard's making the same argument. And Stanford does this too. You know, they can use affirmative action. They include in their huge panoply of criteria for admissions something about race. The argument against that is, you know, let's pick on race as an illegitimate criterion. Let's leave in other stuff like legacy admissions and so on, because we don't have a problem with that. That's essentially, you know, I would say you're looking at the one way systemic racism operates. That's one way it does. It says, oh, you know, I see some kind of disadvantage going on here for me. I'm going to blame that on race. I'm not going to blame it on any number of other things I could also blame it on. So that's I guess my argument against that particular tack is, you know, oh, why focus on affirmative action? How about legacy admissions? That's discriminating against Asians even more strongly than affirmative action. How come they're not suing about that? So there you go.
Well, Gibor, let me say you've got a huge number of people have chimed in to say you've done an outstanding presentation, and at least one person wants you to run for president. But they wouldn't wish you on that job.
Yeah, no, well, don't worry, I wouldn't wish me on that job either. So thanks very much, everybody, for listening.
Thank you, Gibor. This was a really great presentation. Obviously generated a lot of interest. And we're going to have this is recorded, and we will make this available on the web at some point.
We did have one more question that I saw in chat. If we wanted to just close out, certainly you're gone over your time, but we do have 50 or so people still on. If you've got a sec, Gibor,
Sure.
How are foster youth evaluated for admission to UC, and how are they supported after admission to help them graduate? And maybe that will wrap up with that as the last question.
Well, foster youth are evaluated the same way everyone else is, except that foster youth have a bunch of obstacles that they've overcome. If a foster child is applying to Berkeley, they can write a really effective essay about how many barriers they've overcome to get there. And that, you know, that counts in holistic admissions. While I was Vice Chancellor, the Chancellor's wife, Mary Catherine Bergeneau, made foster youth her big activity. And they raised a ton of money. The foster youth support program was in equity and inclusion. So I was happy to participate in a lot of it. They raised so much money that they actually endowed a staff position for that program by the time Bob Bergeneau left. So foster youth were getting really good support here at Berkeley. They would, you know, Mary Catherine would bring them linen when they arrived to their dorm room. So yeah, that was a really heartwarming story. Thanks for the question.
Well, I'll join Bob and Ben to say thanks. Gibor, I appreciate you doing this for us today and sharing this perspective with us today. And we will share your slides. Had some great graphs, so we'd love to share your slides if you're open, along with the recording for today.
Okay.
All right. Thanks again, everyone. We'll see you soon.